Welcome to the Iran This Week podcast with Art Keller for the week ending 13 May 2011. Let's start with a review of the news about Iran. On 6 May, the New York Times reported on Mehrdad Oskoui, Iran's most prominent documentary filmmaker. His films have broached delicate issues like female suicide in traditional communities, juvenile drug addiction, and Iran's crisis of youth identity, themes that could easily land an Iranian in jail. He's best known outside Iran for his 2006 film Nose, Iranian Style, about the prevalence of nose jobs in Iran, a world leader per capita with 60 to 70,000 operations a year. That reflects in part the fierce competition among young women for marriageable men after the 1980s war with Iraq, in which 400,000 Iranian men died. But the film's real target, Mr. Oskoui says, is the consumerism and nihilism of contemporary Iran. In his 2004 film, The Other Side of Burqa, Mr. Oskoui's camera captured the hurried night burial of a young bride who hanged herself from a ceiling fan in a fishing village on the Persian Gulf island of Keshem, an all-too-common occurrence in a traditionalist society where young women can feel trapped. Mr. Oskoui even penetrates the pagan exorcism ritual of Za'ar, a dance that originated in East Africa but is practiced in the coastal regions and islands of southern Iran. It is a wildly expressive dance performed to the driving rhythms of drums and the chants of men, and provides a rare outlet for women to unleash their passions in a restrictive society. Many of the women in the film speak frankly of their struggles with patriarchy and economic hardship, which severely limit their development as individuals. On 8 May, the New York Times reported that Israel's former intelligence chief has said that a strike at Iran's nuclear installations would be a stupid idea, adding that military action might not achieve all its goals and could lead to a long war. The intelligence official, Meir Dagan, who retired in early January after 8 years as director of the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, made the remarks at a conference on Friday. His assessment contradicts the policy of the country's political leaders who have long argued in favor of a credible military option against Iran's nuclear program. The defense minister, Ehud Barak, criticized Mr. Dagan after his comments were widely publicized in the Israeli news media last Sunday. At the end of the day, these issues and decisions belong by their nature to the political echelon, Mr. Barak said, adding that he was not sure that Mr. Dagan's assessment was correct. Mr. Dagan is known to have long opposed military action against Iran, but he has never said so publicly. Mr. Dagan, who also said Friday that Iran must not be allowed to produce nuclear weapons, has advocated covert means of setting back the Iranian program. It is not the first time that Mr. Dagan has courted controversy where Iran is concerned since he left office. In January, he told a group of Israeli reporters that he believed Iran would not be able to build a nuclear weapon before 2015, a year or more later than other Israeli estimates. On 9 May, Reuters reported that Turkish banks that persist in dealing with local branches of a blacklisted Iranian state bank are risking U.S. sanctions, the Treasury Department's top financial intelligence official warned. David Cohen, U.S. Treasury Department's acting Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Crimes, told Reuters on Friday that Turkish branches of Bank Mellat are key conduits for Iran to conduct international transactions, including potentially dangerous weapons proliferation activities. The danger is that Turkish banks that interact with Mellat are providing a pathway for Iran's financial connectivity out into the rest of the international financial system, Cohen said. The United States and the European Union have blacklisted Mellat, but a UN Security Council resolution approved last year does not specifically order the bank to be cut off. Turkey is taking a narrower view of the Iran resolution and has allowed Mellat branches in Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir to continue operating. But the Treasury could cut off some Turkish banks' access to the American financial system if they violate the 10-month-old U.S. law that implements the UN resolution, the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions and Divestment Act, or CSADA. We've told banks, whether or not your government shuts down the Mellat branches, if you are doing significant businesses with Mellat branches in Turkey, you're potentially violating CSADA. If that's the determination we make, you're going to lose your access to the U.S., Cohen said. The Treasury has warned some 50 banks in 20 jurisdictions that significant transactions with any of the 17 blacklisted Iranian banks could result in U.S. sanctions, making dollar-based transactions very difficult. Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan's government, facing a re-election this year, has steadily increased trade with Iran since taking power in 2002 as part of a strategy to make Turkey the regional business and finance hub, while bank regulators leaders in Turkey are mindful of the risk from Iran, many senior officials place a higher priority on trade. The more senior political officials, I think, don't want Iran to infiltrate their banks, but they are much more open to expanded relationships with Iran within the confines of abiding by the UN Security Council resolutions, Cohen said. Turkish authorities have shut down local branches of Bank Sepa, the only major bank specifically singled out in the Security Council resolution. On 9 May, ABC reported Iran's powerful clerics have accused associates of President Mahmoud Ahmadi-Nejad of witchcraft, including summoning genies, amid an increasingly bitter rift between Ahmadinejad and the country's supreme religious leader. In recent days, some 25 confidants of Ahmadinejad and his controversial but loyal chief of staff, Esfandiar Mashai, have been arrested and charged with being magicians. One aide, Abbas Ghaffari, was described by conservative Iranian newspaper Ayan as, quote, a man with special skills in metaphysics and connections with unknown worlds, unquote. Ghaffari has reportedly been accused of summoning a genie who caused his interrogator to have a heart attack. The arrests are the latest window into the growing rift between Ahmadinejad, Iran's secular president, and Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the country's appointed religious supreme leader. As clerical dogma loses traction in Iran, traditional beliefs that incorporate ideas about a coming messiah, the end of the world, and traditional magic motifs like jinns or genies are becoming increasingly popular, especially with Ahmadinejad's base. The religious establishment has long had its eye on Mashai, the man behind much of Ahmadinejad's political and religious thinking, because he practices an alternative, messianic, though no less fundamentalist vision of Islam, which includes aspects of the occult and a more limited role for clerics. Mashai is Ahmadinejad's chief of staff and closest advisor, and it is widely believed that Ahmadinejad wants Mashai to succeed him as Iranian president. 2 weeks ago, Ahmadinejad fired Haidar Moslei, the intelligence minister, accusing the minister of being a spy in the Ahmadinejad government who fed information to the supreme leader about Mashai. Khamenei reinstated the intelligence minister last month, causing the president to sulk for days in his office, avoiding the public and cabinet meetings, effectively not running the country for nearly 2 weeks. A significant part of the religious establishment is afraid of Mashai, who is perceived as a threat to the clerics for several reasons. Mashai promotes a nationalist Iran-first ideology rather than the clerics' Islam-first dogma, and advocates a religious and political view that marginalizes the clergy. Both ideas are popular with Iran's middle class, further making Mashai a threat. The rift has taken on an increasingly spiritual element. Last month, Ahmadinejad loyalists began circulating a DVD documentary anticipating the imminent return of the hidden imam known as the Mahdi, a religious event comparable to the way Christians anticipate the second coming of Christ. While belief in the Mahdi's return is central to Shia Islam, the Iranian clerical establishment has never predicted a specific time for his return. On 10 May, Reuters reported that Iran's nuclear negotiator has said the next talks with world powers must be held without pressure. The Iranian position was set out in a response to a letter sent by EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton 3 months ago as Western states try to get Iran to commit to new talks. Iranian chief negotiator Saeed Jalili, in his letter to Ashton, underlined that the next talk should be just and refrain from resorting to pressure instruments. Analysts said that such references were Iranian code, meaning there could be no discussion of enrichment, which Tehran sees as its sovereign right. President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad said again on Monday that Iran would not give ground on enrichment. Alluding to Jalili's letter, an EU source said, "At this stage, there's basically a risk we're going to end up going round in circles. We're not making much progress. The six powers may be unwilling to rush back to talks with Iran without any prospect of agreement, especially since many Western diplomats say it is in Iran's interest to drag out talks while it increases its stockpile of enriched uranium." Moreover, Jalili's letter reiterated Iran's wish to discuss broader economic and security issues, which Western powers say are irrelevant to the core international concerns about the nature of Iran's enrichment program. Jalili's letter said the talks should cover, for example, the root causes of terrorism, drug trafficking, piracy in the high seas, enhanced cooperation on energy supply and security, as well as nuclear disarmament, a reference to the big powers' nuclear arsenals. In Paris, the French Foreign Ministry called on Tehran to respond constructively to Ashton. Iran resists UN inspections of its atomic sites. On 12 May, Reuters reported that Russia is attempting to suppress a United Nations report that says Iran has been breaking a UN arms embargo by shipping weapons to Syria, Western diplomats said on Thursday. Russia has objected to the publication of the report as an official Security Council document, a council diplomat told Reuters on condition of anonymity. It's obviously an attempt to protect Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, who is coming under increasing international pressure over his violent crackdown on anti-government protesters, another council diplomat said. The confidential report said most of Iran's breaches of the embargo have been deliveries of weapons to Syria, which Western diplomats say were to be passed on to Lebanese and Palestine militants. The report was by the UN Security Council's panel of experts, a newly formed committee that reports on compliance with 4 rounds of UN sanctions imposed on Iran. Diplomats say Russia offered a procedural justification for objecting to the publication of the report, claiming that it should first be discussed by Security Council's Iran Sanctions Committee before being released to the public. Eventually, they'll have to give in, but we don't know how long it will take, a diplomat said. Russia is able to block the Iran report because decisions about such reports are made by consensus among the 15 members of the Security Council. Russia's decision to block the report comes as diplomats said France and Britain were attempting to revive plans to have the Security Council condemn Syria for its crackdown against demonstrators. A previous attempt failed after Russia, China, and India objected to the proposed condemnation. Russia has long acted as a kind of protector for Iran on the Council, working hard to dilute the 4 sanctions resolutions on Iran between 2006 and 2010 before voting in favor of them. It also has close commercial ties to the Islamic Republic. On 13 May, the Wall Street Journal reported that the Iranian exile group, once allied with Saddam Hussein, has enlisted former top U.S. officials, including former heads of the CIA, FBI, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as politicians from both parties, to try to get it removed from the State Department's terrorist list. The Mujahideen-e-Khalq has deployed the heavyweights on speaking tours in Washington and European capitals, hoping to convey the image of a popular democratic alternative to Tehran's ruling clerics. Obama administration and European officials, however, fear the campaign could undermine Washington's policy of reaching out to opposition forces in Iran. They say that because the U.S. would appear to be aligned with a group that is widely unpopular due to its military alliance with Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein during the 1980s and 90s, and a string of terrorist attacks the U.S. says it launched inside Iran. Among the group's newfound cheerleaders are recently departed members of President Barack Obama's national security team, including Jim Jones, the former national security advisor, Dennis Blair, the former director of national intelligence, and James Woolsey, who headed the Central Intelligence Agency for 2 years during the Clinton administration. On 13 May, Reuters reported that North Korea and Iran appeared to have been regularly exchanging ballistic missile technology in violation of UN sanctions. The report said the illicit technology transferred had transshipped through a neighboring third country. That country was China, several diplomats told Reuters on condition of anonymity. The report was submitted to the Security Council by a group that monitors compliance with UN sanctions imposed on Pyongyang after it conducted 2 nuclear tests in 2006 and 2009. The UN sanctions included a ban on trade in nuclear and missile technology with North Korea, as well as an arms embargo. They also banned trade with a number of North Korean firms and called for asset freezes and travel bans on some North Korean individuals. Prohibited ballistic missile-related items are suspected to have been transferred between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Islamic Republic of Iran on regular scheduled flights of Air Koryo and Iran Air, the report said. Further evidence of Iran's cooperation with North Korea on missile technology came during a military parade in October 2010, the report said, when North Korea displayed a new warhead for its Nodong missile. The warhead had, quote, a strong design similarity with the Iranian Shahab-3 triconic warhead, unquote. On 13 May, AFP reported that Iranian President Ahmadi-Nejad on Saturday dismissed 3 ministers whose portfolios are being merged with other ministries as part of a cabinet streamlining. Those who will lose their jobs include Oil Minister Masoud Mirkazemi, whose responsibilities are being merged with the Energy Ministry. Welfare Minister Sadek Masouli and Industries Minister Ali Akbar Merabian also go, as their responsibilities are merged with the Labor and Commerce Ministries respectively. The departures are part of a streamlining of the cabinet provided for under Iran's development plan for 2010 to 2015, which requires the numbers of posts to be cut from 21 to 17. Transport Minister Hamid Beabani already lost his job in February when he failed to survive an impeachment motion in Parliament. His responsibilities have been merged with the Housing Ministry. The mechanics of the downsizing have been a source of tension for weeks between the president and Parliament. Ahmadinejad says that cabinet appointments are his prerogative, but Parliament insists it must approve the new portfolios and who holds them. A widely reported war of words erupted this week between Ahmadinejad and Parliament Speaker Ali Larijani on the issue before Iran's powerful Guardians Council intervened and sided with Parliament. On 13 May, the Associated Press reported that the spiritual mentor of Iran's president has harshly criticized him for his role in an internal power struggle that has split the country's hardliners. The cleric, the Ayatollah Mesbah Yazdi, is the latest in a series of high-profile figures to censure Ahmadinejad. Yazdi said Ahmadinejad's behavior is increasingly turning friends into enemies and demonstrating what he called illogical and cheap behavior. Yazdi made his comments in an interview published Saturday in the hardline weekly Shoma. Ahmadinejad and his backers are struggling to regroup after the stinging rebuke by Khamenei over the dismissal of the intelligence minister. The showdown was interpreted as further evidence of a growing rift between Ahmadinejad and the ruling theocracy and a sign that Khamenei is seeking to tighten his grip on political affairs before parliamentary elections next year and a presidential election in 2013 that will choose Ahmadinejad's successor. Sensing his vulnerability, rivals in parliament are raising more challenges to Ahmadinejad, including calls to bring him before the chamber for questioning over his policies and alleged constitutional violations. That concludes the news roundup for this week. Please send your questions or comments on any of the above news stories to iran.thisweek@artkeller.com. And now on to questions and comments from the desk of Art Keller. I've been watching with increasing amazement the growing rift between Supreme Leader Khamenei and President Ahmadinejad. It strikes me that for all former President Khatami's reformist attempts, current President Ahmadinejad is posing a much more serious threat to the rule of the Supreme Leader than Khatami ever did. Ahmadinejad has cannily leveraged popular support of the lower and middle classes and been harshly criticized for his backing of his chief of staff, Esfandiar Mashayi, against the traditional religious establishment. Normally, I'd cheer at dissension in the ranks of the hardliners, but according to all my guests in recent months, the Green movement is not particularly well poised to exploit dissension, as the Greens have little more support in the lower economic classes than do the ruling clerics striving to rein in Ahmadinejad. As political theater, though, the slugfest is fun to watch. Things in Iran are taking an increasingly bizarre turn, with competing claims from the Supreme Leader and Ahmadinejad's camps about who may be in touch with the Mahdi, the so-called hidden imam, who is prophesied to return and lead Iranian troops to conquer Baghdad and Jerusalem. The Supreme Leader's mouthpiece, Kayhan, recently published an article that said that there are in fact people in Iran in mystical contact with the hidden imam, just not anybody associated with Ahmadinejad. The Supreme Leader essentially seems to be claiming that my magicians and mystics are better than Ahmadinejad's. But for all that this debate has been dressed up in mystical symbolism, I think this is really just a naked power grab on the part of Ahmadinejad and Mashayi. But in a theocracy, power grabs have to be prettied up in religious language. And on that note, it's time to continue my talk with Iranian political cartoonist and journalist Nikahang Kowsar, whose cartoons have appeared in the New York Times and a variety of other publications, and who is the creator and editor of the Khodnevis website. Part 1 aired last week. Here is the second and concluding part of our discussion. It brings me up to a press article, and it was complaining that the regime was busing in teenage boys as young as 14 and 15, putting truncheons in their hands and using them to put down protests. And that report was just talking about it, that this is bad from a human rights perspective. But another person I talked to, a Dr. Hashmi, was telling me, well, it is a human rights problem, but the other thing that it points up is maybe there are cracks in the ranks of the IRGC and the Basiji that they're having to bus in rural teenagers, because if the Basiji in the cities were perfectly reliable, maybe they wouldn't need to do that. What do you think of that interpretation? Is there any truth to that, or is that wishful thinking?
I'm not sure about it, because based on the reports we had, many youngsters who cannot actually officially join the Basij forces have actually tried to buy batons or clubs and participate in such activities for their future.
Okay.
To get, possibly they might even get paid. I'm not sure. In one of the reports, yes, they were paid, but I don't have any records of that. But on the other hand, we always say, we say Basijis, but we don't know the exact number of Basijis because many actually government employees have Basij cards. So in a way they can be Basijis, but they're not real Basijis. They have had to actually participate in Basij courses. So we have different interpretations of Basiji.
Right. Well, I mean, that does sound like in a lot of repressive regimes, you have to do something to informally show you're joining. Certainly in Saddam's Iraq, there were a lot of people who had to be a Ba'ath Party member just to get a job as a teacher. They weren't active participants. It was just a hoop they had to jump through, essentially.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that's good to know. It can sometimes be hard to judge from a distance without being on the streets.
And one other thing I should add is that in the past 6 years, many people, members of the lower classes, have tried to gain some money by getting closer to the Basijis or to the people who are supportive of Mr. Ahmadinejad. And there have been a lot of reports on money that these families have received for just even writing a support letter or even a letter to Ahmadinejad. I mean, the guy has written a letter and then received a check for $400. That would have been enough to live for another 2 months for him in rural parts of the country. And Ahmadinejad and his team have actually paid more attention to the lower classes. So many members of the lower classes who hate the middle class are willing to do whatever possible to harm the middle class.
That makes me kind of wonder then, where do things stand if you have such a firm split with lower economic classes willing to support Ahmadinejad as long as essentially they're bribed by him. But obviously the money for that kind of thing is limited or they wouldn't be slashing subsidies in the first place. So the pot of money is not infinite.
That's true.
What happens when the money for that runs out? Do they come over to the middle class side? Or a related question, which is how does a green movement, which is largely middle class, kind of more intellectual, extend its base into lower economic classes?
There has always been this critique on the leaders of the green movement that they have not been trying to reach out to the working classes and people of the working class or also the lower class people in Iran, and that has been a big problem, and that's why they cannot remove their rivals from power easily. I think it was last year that I wrote an article when something had happened to the family of one of the labor activists, Mr. Osanzu's family. That's why couldn't Mir Hossein Mousavi or Mr. Karoubi go and visit the family and support them. The good thing was that in a few days after my article was posted, Mr. Karoubi went and visited the family, and later Zahra Rahnavar, the wife of Mr. Mousavi, went to visit that family. It was very comforting for many members of the labor movement, but it wasn't enough because they have not actually supported the green movement in a real way. There have been times that members of the labor movement have actually participated in demonstrations and protests, but I think that has not been enough. There's a big gap, and one of the reasons I think is that when Mr. Mousavi accepted Mr. Hashemi Rafsanjani as his supporter, in a way as the kingmaker, and many policies of Mr. Rafsanjani were not liked by the laborers and the unions. So something very bitter for the labor movement to see Mr. Mousavi, who had somehow left his past to be embedded with Mr. Rafsanjani and have to follow his rhetoric. And I think there is some bad blood somewhere. I don't know where exactly, between Mr. Mousavi and the labor movement. And until that's not removed, and Mr. Mousavi would possibly, of course, when he's free, try to become the voice of the labor movement, nothing would happen. And that's probably a big blow to the green movement, because if they had the support of the labor movement, they would have been more powerful. And on the other hand, Mr. Mousavi has not been able to get connected to the lower class. That's the strong side of Mr. Ahmadinejad right now. Although, as you said, this would have to end someday. I don't know when exactly. But in the 1980s, Mr. Mousavi was known as a person who supported the lower class. But what happened that now the lower class does not support Mr. Mousavi? So I think there are a lot of things that have to be solved and resolved, and possibly I think the removal of Mr. Hashemi Rafsanjani from the supporting team, not only Hashemi Rafsanjani, but his clan who somehow want to play a part in this political game, then something positive might happen for Mr. Mousavi.
Not to sound overly grim, but it almost sounds like, of course, Hashemi Rafsanjani is a rather elderly gentleman, that he might do the Green movement a favor by dying off and removing his support from the movement.
I think yes, because the Green movement has paid a lot for having his name on it for many times. And there's this belief that the February 11th demonstrations in 2010 were actually ruined by what Mr. Rafsanjani had asked his followers to do. He wanted the people to participate in the demonstrations, but as a support to the Islamic regime in a way. And his websites, the news websites that were supporters of Mr. Rafsanjani and the Green movement, asked the people to act like the Trojan horse and go among the public in the demonstrations and just bring out their green signs. It didn't work. Many people were actually arrested for having anything green on them. From that day, we always make a joke of the Trojan horse theory, because it almost ruined everything from that date. And the next major demonstrations was, I think, on the first anniversary of the June 2009 elections, and Mr. Mousavi and Mr. Karoubi had to cancel the demonstrations. And that was a big blow to the Green movement as well, because when you don't have any demonstrations or physical presence and just a part of the middle class is chanting online and not doing anything physically, so you cannot see any signs of the movement on the streets. And that was something that could have helped them to show that the movement is there, although it's a little bit limited. And after that date, we have a sort of part-time movement or part-time revolution. And usually part-time things do not work.
Yeah. You really have to devote your full attention and have everyone fully on board to pull off a revolution, and broad support, which they obviously don't yet have until they get the lower classes on board. I'm guessing you've likely already done a cartoon on the subject, or if not, will be doing one, and I just haven't seen it yet. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the recent statements by the Supreme Leader, where he's praising all these democratic movements in Egypt and Tunisia and saying they were inspired by the 79 revolution, and yet he's silent on Syria. And then government spokesman and Ahmadi-Nejad are saying, oh, well, Syria is different. Those are inspired by international plots. Obviously, there's a bit of a disconnect between how they're perceiving the democratic striving in one place and in another. You're working on a cartoon on that one by any chance?
I did a cartoon on the Supreme Leader and turning him into a pharaoh a few months ago. He looked like Ramses, and it became one of those cartoons that were on hundreds of email lists. And many people emailed that cartoon to me as well. So that was funny.
To you?
Yes.
Didn't they see N-I-K at the bottom?
It's funny because many people resend those cartoons to me because I'm on their lists as well. And then I could possibly have an estimation that how many people have seen the cartoon. It's a rough estimate. So, like, I see, let's say, 30,000 hits on a cartoon on my website. I think it would be possibly about 600,000 people may have seen that cartoon through all those email lists. I'm not sure how many, but there are rough estimates on that. So that's a good thing for me. But on the recent events, just 2 weeks ago, my father-in-law passed away, so I had to just get off for a few days, and I couldn't work. But it was just in between the Syrian movement, and I lost the chance to draw a few cartoons for that movement because of loss of sense of humor. But if I want to draw a cartoon about the Syrian thing, I wanted to actually draw an octopus, meaning Iran to be the octopus. And the Syrian people could have cut one of the arms of that octopus that was trying to pass help to Lebanon. Both the people of Syria and I think a majority of people of Lebanon would have been very happy. And what I see the whole thing is they somehow support, the Iranians supported the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolutions because they hated Mubarak. I mean, the Iranian government hated Mubarak.
Yeah.
And although they tolerated Ben Ali in a way, there were a few meetings between Ahmadinejad and Ben Ali, but there wasn't a very friendly relationship between the two countries. They weren't enemies, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, the thing about Iran and Syria is totally different. And they support the Shiites in Bahrain. That's understandable because Bahrain was one of our, in a way, provinces. It belonged to Iran a few decades ago. It was part of Iran. So there is some concern among many Iranians that do they want to get Bahrain back or not? Of course, I think this is far from reality. But the thing is, many ayatollahs, many officials supported the Bahrain Shiites, but were silent to what was happening to the people in Syria.
Yeah.
So there are always double standards or even triple standards in Iran. If you like a country or if you like a majority of people, you go for them and you don't pay attention to other things. On the other hand, I see a sort of rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia on Bahrain and on the other side and other places right now in the region. And I don't think Iran would like to see anything pleasant happening for Saudi Arabia and its allies.
Yeah,
and
there's some bad blood there between Saudi Arabia does not want to see Iran's influence expanded.
Exactly. And a friend of mine who is an analyst, a Kurdish analyst, tells me that there is this talk that even any political activities against the Iranian government in Kurdistan, possibly even somehow influenced by people who have connections to Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure of that. I've just heard it, but they're playing a game in that region. I'm not an analyst. You are an analyst, but what I can see is something's weird is happening right now. It seems that these two big octopuses are trying to cut their arms off in different sections of the region. I don't know how it would work out, but I'm just witnessing the history on fast forward.
Well, it's an interesting time, and I've yet to hear anyone who convincingly has a handle on how it's all going to work out throughout the region. When you unleash the democratic movements, it's a great opportunity, but things can also go disastrously wrong in a variety of ways. It can only just help for the best.
Exactly.
One last cartoon that I saw that kind of caught my eye. It showed a bloody-handed Ahmadinejad literally stepping on the bodies of presumably protesters or just Iranians in general. And then President Obama with his hands over his eyes and his hand out to shake the blood-dripping hand of Ahmadinejad, with the implication being that if you engage with the regime in a serious way, you do it at the cost of ignoring the brutality of the regime against Iranian people. So to me, that suggests that you don't necessarily think from the U.S. side that, quote unquote, engaging Iran is the correct policy. What do you think the U.S. should be doing?
No, actually, I think it could be a good policy, but closing the eyes on what the Iranian government has done to the people is, I think, something that the Iranian nation, the people in Iran, would not support. I think I drew this cartoon about a year and a half ago. It was, I think, 5 or 6 months after the election. It was referring to another attempt by President Obama to actually start a better relationship with the Iranian government. And what this President Obama had said during his inauguration, ask the dictators to unclench their fists, and then the United States would shake hands with them. So I think when Mr. Ahmadinejad is actually opening his fist to shake a hand, Mr. Obama should actually pay more attention to what this has done. It hasn't been sanitized enough, actually. I always remember what Mr. Obama said in his book, in his first time he went to the White House to meet President Bush, and President Bush had used a sanitizer after shaking hands with President Obama. And I have this always on my mind.
Gotcha.
But this time, I think President Obama wasn't paying attention to what Mr. Ahmadinejad should have done. Of course, you cannot bring everything to one cartoon, but I had this on my mind when I was drawing it. It was, to me, although many people did not like it at that time, they said that, no, you have to support anything. I'm a cartoonist. I do not support anything. I just criticize. I think for the Iranian people, it's very important to see if any government who is dealing with Iran actually respects their concerns. I just wanted people to know that there are many concerns, and thank God many people in Washington had seen the cartoon.
It reminds me of the fundamental dilemma in American foreign policy. You can do one of two things. You can try and deal with whoever's in power in a country, and I'm not just referring to Iran here, I mean any country, and try and have a pragmatic relationship with them. Or if you think they're so bad, you can try and support people who want to get them out. But either one of those choices, and particularly in the case of Iran, given the history of 1953, either one of those choices is not great choices, because there's really no way that, as far as I see it, the U.S. can support people who want to overthrow the regime in a way that's not actually going to backfire. And the worst thing that we could do is say, let's give money or anything to the Green Movement, because then it would come to be seen as a U.S. pawn.
Right.
But at the same time, you don't want to give legitimacy to the current regime. So it's kind of a minefield from the U.S. perspective of how do you deal with it?
I think there are many think tanks in Washington, and this may cause some frustration because you see, like in 2008, Ray Takei would say something, or Vali Nasr later would say something else. Another individual from another think tank would say something else. And I don't know who's paying attention to what's happening inside the country and what these very bright intellectuals are saying. I think all these mixed messages are not heard very well or are not managed very well in some periods of time. For instance, in 2009, many people inside the country wanted to see the same support that they saw from President Obama when he was supporting, let's say, the North African and Middle Eastern uprising. Although the whole nature of the governments of Egypt and, let's say, Tunisia are different with the Iranian government, and the connections are also different because at least Egypt was an ally of the United States. Iran is not an ally. So the pressure that Mr. Obama put on the Egyptian government could have actually worked, but not on the Iranian government. And people in Iran actually wanted to see some sort of a support. Okay, Mr. Obama paid attention to Nida al-Sultan, and that was very important. And whenever one of the Iranian activists or political prisoners are mentioned in a very good manner in the States, many people in Iran approve this kind of support. Like yesterday at the National Press Club, Mr. Ahmad Zaidabadi received his Freedom of Press Award from UNESCO, and Mrs. Hillary Clinton sent an official message to that gathering. So that's very important for the public inside Iran. They respect this kind. They don't call this meddling. So they needed some moral support in 2009, more than what they saw.
Yeah, my own position has been looking back over the history of attempted regime change by the U.S. If you look at that, you can destabilize a country that's already rocky, but building up something from the shattered pieces of that is a far harder task.
Yes, and almost impossible.
Yeah, in many of the places were destabilized with the thought of, we'll just get out this bad guy. Later, they had to send in troops to kind of stabilize things, which was originally what they were trying to avoid by doing a covert action on the cheap in the first place. So my thought is really
exactly
covert action is not what it is cracked up to be.
Right.
In the particular case of Iran, moral support may be about the best that we can do for now, and that the other thing we should be doing is getting ready for the day when the regime kind of collapses under its own weight, and then being ready to give active support in building democratic institutions when there's a new fledgling state there, but one that came to be of its own accord and not because we pushed it.
I totally agree. And because of the bad history that people in Iran have because of the 1953 events and the bad memory that many actually could not easily forget, yes, any military intervention or supporting covert actions would not be actually supported by the nation. But there have been times that they've wished that a very strong moral support could have put more pressure on the Iranian government. Although I'm not a big fan of economic sanctions, but anything that could hit the leaders of the country harder than this, I think would be fully supported by a majority of people. Because all these sanctions that we're hearing about, all those people who have abused human rights after 2009, is something that many people approve it inside the country. But they say it's not enough because we have had human rights abuse from day one of the revolution. Many people who have been involved in executions were actually members of the reformists. I had this joke in Iran that any torturer would become a reformist in 10 to 15 years. So many people who were actually members of the reform movement were members of the Ministry of Intelligence in the 1980s and involved in actually getting rid of different political parties and interrogating people, and even, as many say, executing many political activists in the 1980s. So I think we shouldn't have any double standards just for political gains, but there should be stronger sanctions on powerful people inside Iran. Like, they know that, okay, Mr. Khamenei has given all those orders, but many people inside Iran, although it's very difficult to impose sanctions specifically on the leaders of the country, but these people have their own interests in different countries. There was this rumor, I'm not sure if it's true, that there was a bank account in London that belonged to the son of Ayatollah Khamenei. It's a rumor, but what happened to that bank account? What happened next? There has been this rumor for years that the Rafsanjani family has invested in Canada and other places of the world. Who's monitoring their interests and their bank accounts?
It's funny, there was recently a news story saying that, I think it's a finance ministry or someone said, Iranians, they can't speculate or invest on foreign exchanges, yet at the same time, I'm very much sure that people in the senior ranks have their foreign bank accounts in Liechtenstein or Switzerland or elsewhere. I do know some basic efforts have been made, at least with regard to nuclear things, to target specific people or companies within the IRGC, which I think is a step in the right direction because,
Right.
a lot of the sanctions on Iraq were just too harmful to the common Iraqis.
Exactly.
Sanctions are tricky because they're kind of a blunt instrument, so it's hard to fine-tune them.
Exactly. I know that there are people inside, let's say, the Iranian regime who are actually benefiting from those sanctions against their rivals. I think it was a year ago when a very close person to former President Rafsanjani was telling me, if you are going to Washington, go and see these guys and tell them you can push Ahmadinejad's generals and the government and Iran actually by imposing more sanctions. And that was a question to me. How could somebody close to President Rafsanjani want more sanctions imposed on his rivals? But the sanctions are going to have some bad influence on the public. I mean, economic sanctions would actually hit the public. So if they want more sanctions for their own political gain, that doesn't sound right. It should be for everyone. So they were sure that nothing's going to happen to them because of politics of the whole thing. The sanctions should also be fine-tuned so that people wouldn't have to pay for what the politicians are doing.
That's the trouble from the outside. If you're looking at how to change the behavior of people who are doing bad things to their own citizens, sometimes there aren't really a whole lot of options except to wait for that government to go away. But that doesn't do a whole lot to help the people who are suffering it in the meantime.
Right.
I'd like to thank cartoonist and journalist Nikahang Kowsar for coming on the podcast. Please send your questions and comments about the podcast to Iran This Week at artkeller.com. That concludes the podcast for the week ending May 13th, 2011. Goodbye and Khuda Hafez.